Are you thinking about coming off Xanax, but you're worried about the withdrawal symptoms? If you are, you're not alone. And in this video, we're going to be covering a step-by-step approach to getting safely off Xanax in comfort while you remain in control every step of the way. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, and I specialize in helping people safely taper off psychiatric medications. And with Xanax in particular, I know this problem well because I did take this drug for about 6 months and then safely came off of it. So I really know this issue inside and out. And my hope is that by the end of this video, coming off Xanax will be demystified. I'm even going to include a whole range of resources to help you taper off with your doctor in the links below this video. So you have that waiting for you at the end. So let's dive in. Just quickly, let's talk about some of the reasons why people want to come off Xanax. Well, one of the big ones that I see a lot of times is that patients are worried that their doctors are going to cut them off. Now, ever since the opiate epidemic, doctors have been really wary of prescribing these medications because so many doctors got sued during the opiate epidemic and there was this big crackdown. And so what a lot of people find is that their doctors start to try and pressure them off these medications. And if that's happened to you, that's really scary because sometimes they try and force people to come off in like a month, and that can be very difficult. So now what a lot of people are worried about when they come to my practice is, hey, what happens if my doctor retires all of a sudden and I can't get it? Or what happens if I'm like older and I'm in a nursing home someday and someone just decides to get me off the medication and I'm not really with it enough to advocate for myself? And so there's a lot of reasons people are nervous about being on this medication now because they just don't like being in a position where they could have it kind of pulled away from them suddenly. The second reason why I see people wanting to come off a lot is they just don't feel good anymore. Now, this was something that happened to me after my daughter was born and I was doing a lot of night shifts and I was taking this medication. Very soon I started taking it every day. And what I noticed was I was having a lot of obsessive thoughts and my anxiety level was actually getting higher and my memory was poor. And these were completely new symptoms for me. And this isn't uncommon. In fact, this happens to a lot of people on long-term benzos. Over time, gradually, their anxiety starts to get worse. And so if you're someone that started taking this medication and you're feeling worse, it may be due to the drug. That's not that uncommon. And then the last reason is people just hate being dependent on a medication sometimes. People want to be able to retire and take off and go on a 3-month trip in like Europe and not have to worry about losing a medication or getting one of these drugs filled over there because it can be really challenging. And so if any of these reasons resonated with you, I want you to know you're in the right place because this video is going to show you how to safely get off this medication and get it done right the first time. Okay, so what's the first step to coming off Xanax? Well, the first thing that you need to do is to make sure that you're not on any other stimulating medications. And so this would include things like ADHD or stimulating antidepressants like Wellbutrin. Tapering off a drug like Xanax is going to be a lot harder if you're on a stimulant. And here's why. The main withdrawal effects of Xanax are anxiety and insomnia. And these are also common side effects of stimulant medications. And based on my experience with hundreds of patients, and I've done hundreds of these benzo tapers now, tapering is just so much easier when someone is not on a stimulating medication. I find that it's a lot easier to do the reductions, and so people can taper a lot faster. And so I would advise you, if you're thinking about coming off, is to first look at any stimulating drugs you're on and make a plan to come off those. Thankfully, coming off stimulating medications tends to be a lot easier than coming off sedatives. So most people are able to withdraw off these medications within a couple of months. Building on this, the next thing you could do to make your withdrawal a lot easier is to consider coming off substances like caffeine and nicotine. Again, the rationale is similar with the medications. You know, if you're drinking a lot of caffeine or caffeinated sodas, it's going to impair your sleep and it's also going to make you feel a little wired. That's the same with nicotine. Now, if you're coming off a sedative, something that helps people sleep and something that reduces anxiety, you're not going to want to be experiencing those side effects. And so just like with the medications, it's going to make people more vulnerable. I know this can be a sore subject for a lot of people, especially with the caffeine. And so if you're unable to completely give up caffeine and you're not comfortable just going to decaf, what I would recommend is no more than 100 milligrams of a caffeinated beverage before 10 a.m. That equates to a small coffee, essentially. And if you keep it before 10 a.m., the chance of it impacting your sleep is much less. But really try and avoid any caffeinated beverages after 10 a.m. Okay, so once you've gotten rid of the stimulating medications, you need to come into this with the right mindset. And the number one mindset that you need to have in coming off a drug like a benzodiazepine is picking the right pace. This is probably the most important part of this entire video, so I would listen carefully here. Everyone tapers at a different pace, and the only way to safely get off Xanax is to listen to your body and go at a speed that works for you. The goal of successful tapering is really to lower the medication in a way where the withdrawal symptoms remain mild and tolerable. So what does mild and tolerable mean? Well, ideally, they shouldn't interfere with your life. While you're tapering this medication, you should be able to go to work, you should be able to fulfill your duties at home and with your family. And so how do you do this? Well, it's done by reducing the dose in small, customized increments and then waiting for your brain to adapt to each reduction. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, let's set some context. If you've been on this drug for many months or many years, your brain has essentially adapted to it. It has changed the receptors in your brain because the drug is a GABA drug. Essentially, it's going to downregulate those GABA receptors. And those are the receptors which, when stimulated, they make the brain calm and they make the body calm. And so because you're having a drug that acts on them so much, those receptors have gone away. Okay, so what you're doing when you reduce the benzodiazepine is you're going to drop a dose. And because those receptors have been suppressed by this constant presence of this drug, your brain is now going to be in a more excitatory state. And that's going to trigger withdrawal symptoms. And now when that happens, your brain is going to say, I don't like this. And it's going to start to regrow some of those GABA receptors that have been suppressed by the drug. And after it has done that, after it has readapted to the drug being pulled out of the system, the withdrawal symptoms are going to go away. And so the whole game of tapering is essentially to do a reduction, which you can tolerate, allow the receptors to regrow, do another reduction, allow them to regrow more. And this just allows your brain to kind of gradually readapt to the absence of the drug. And that's going to allow you to come off without triggering a lot of withdrawal symptoms. Now, this speed in coming off really varies for each person. Some people have these really like elastic brains and they can come off in very large amounts and the receptors in the brain just rapidly regrow and they don't experience very severe withdrawal symptoms. But other people, their brains for whatever reason are less elastic and you just need to go at a slower rate and allow the brain's receptor system just to regrow. And that's what the next section is about. It's all about how you find this speed where you can comfortably come off. So let's move on to talking about how do you pick the starting rate? Well, from doing this with a lot of people, most people are able to tolerate a 5 to 10% reduction per month. And so I often recommend starting there. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to do this same rate the entire taper. It's just a starting point. What we really recommend is flexible tapering, meaning that you can adjust the speed. You might say drop 5% of your dose to begin with, and then you wait 30 days and then you say, well, that was okay. I'm going to go to 10%. Next month you drop 10% and that's okay. And you go, well, maybe I could do 15%. And then that month you drop 15% and then you say, whoa, actually I'm having some withdrawal symptoms. I don't like that. And so you go back to 10% and then you're just going to stay with that 10% reduction. And then you just keep on following that down because now you've found the fastest rate that your brain is able to tolerate. Now, for some people listening to this, you might be thinking, wait, 5 to 10%? How am I going to do that? My tablets come in like 0.5s, 1 milligrams. That's not 5 to 10% reductions. And you're absolutely right. So you have to get creative with the method that you use for tapering. So let's start with some context here. Really, there are two ways that you can taper Xanax. You can taper it with tablets and cutting tablets and splitting tablets down, or you could do it with liquids. Now, what I found in my experience is that it's quite easy to taper using tablets down to about 1 milligram of Xanax per day, at which point I recommend going to a liquid. Now, there's a reason for this, and the reason comes down to the size of the tablets. So, for instance, if we were going to look at alprazolam, which is the generic name for Xanax, if you can see here, so the 0.25 milligram tablets come like this, and they are very small. Sometimes they come as these little blue ovals as well. And now, typically, when it comes to a tablet, I think it's quite safe to, when you use a pill cutter, to split it into quarters. But for these Xanax tablets, I used to take them, so I know what they look like. They are so tiny that I wouldn't recommend quartering them. The smallest I think you could accurately split them is actually in half. What that means is the lowest dose of Xanax that I think you can get with a tablet is going to be 0.125 milligrams. And so to just do some simple math here, if you're at a total dose of 1 milligram of Xanax, and you were to do a reduction of 0.125, that's a 12.5% reduction there. Now, for many people, that's going to be too fast. That's why I think it's a good idea to start switching over to a liquid once you get down to the 1 milligram mark with the Xanax. And if you just work with your doctor and your doctor's prescribing you Xanax tablets, I think it's quite easy to knock the dose down to 1 milligram. But after 1 milligram, the size of the tablets is simply not small enough for you to gently reduce the dose. And so at that point, you're going to switch over to a liquid form. And this is all super relevant to the US, but if you're not in the US, you could ask your pharmacist if they make manufactured liquid alprazolam, which is Xanax. But you can go on GoodRx and you can see how much it costs. So in the US, a bottle of solution, at least near me in Park City, you could get it for about $47. So this is a 1 milligram to 1 ml solution. So let's say you were just taking 1 milligram of Xanax at night and that was your dose. To replace it with this 1 milligram solution, you would just get a 1 ml syringe. Now, this is the brand that we like. We really like the Baxa syringes. I'll put a link in the description below. And essentially, because the solution is 1 milligram equals 1 ml, if you just get a 1 ml syringe like this, that's your whole dose. Now, the really cool thing about the Baxa syringes, which I like, is that they have all of these little spaces here. And what you'll notice is that there's 10 spaces between the large numbers. So between 0.9 ml and 1 ml, there's these 10 little spaces. And so essentially you have 100 spaces on this syringe. And what that means is that this syringe has the ability to taper you in 1% reductions, which is really, really precise. And it's also very accurate. Now, some people do complain that the lines are too close together. I get that. And a lot of my patients actually just buy a magnifying glass so they can kind of look at the lines under the magnifying glass. And so that may be something that's helpful. So now let's talk about what you could do with this syringe. Let's say you want to do a 5% reduction every 30 days now. What you do essentially is you're just going to pop that down 5 spaces, and that's a 5% reduction. If you wanted to do a 3% reduction, you just pop it down 3 spaces. It's just a very precise and controlled way that you can make dose reductions. Now, I need to warn you about something that happens when you get to the lower dose ranges of tapering Xanax. Usually this is kicked in by about 0.5 milligram. So when you're at 0.5 milligram or below, you need to be aware of this. There's an interesting quirk with how these drugs bind the receptors, where at the lower dose range, it's almost like that low dose of the drug has really saturated the receptor a lot, and that the receptor doesn't get much additional benefit of going from, 0.5 milligram to 1 milligram and so on. And so the most potent part of the drug effect is really what's really happening with that first 0.5 milligram. Now, the significance of that when it comes to tapering means that as you start to remove that last milligram, the drug is going to start disconnecting from the receptor at a really fast rate. And so while you may have been able to tolerate quite large reductions previously, maybe like 0.5 milligram, 0.25 milligrams, and maybe you did that the whole way down from like a 2 milligrams of Xanax, once you get to that last 0.5 milligram, if you were to try a reduction like that, you might all of a sudden unknowingly uncover half of the receptor and cause yourself a lot of withdrawal symptoms. And so when you get to that lower dose range, don't be surprised if you do a reduction and you feel a lot of withdrawal symptoms. It just means that you need to go back to the previous dose and then you need to try a slower reduction. It doesn't mean you can't come off the drug. It just means that you've hit a point where you need to start moving even slower. One of my colleagues, Dr. Mark Horowitz, talks a lot about this phenomena, and he describes the way you need to taper the end of the drug as hyperbolic tapering, where the size of the reductions essentially get smaller once you get to the lower dose range. And so I say this because I don't want anyone getting to the end, doing a reduction, having a lot of withdrawal symptoms, and then feeling trapped like they can't come off. Essentially what you need to do is to move at an even slower rate. So let's say hypothetically, you're at 0.5 milligram of Xanax and you say you drop it by 0.1. So you do a 20% reduction, you go from 0.5 to 0.4. And you have a lot of withdrawal and you say, wait, this is crazy. Up until now, I've been able to do this, 0.1% reduction. What's going on? What you would need to do at that point is you're going to go back up to the 0.5 milligram. And then you're going to do a reduction of 0.05 instead of 0.1. And you might find that that's a lot more tolerable. For some people, though, it can actually get a little trickier than that. They'll find that, they can't do that, even that 0.05 reduction, which would have been a 10% reduction. And that's when I would recommend you actually swap to something that we call like micro tapering. And so to understand micro tapering, I need to contrast it against the cut and hold approach to tapering. And this is just where you take an amount of the drug out every 30 days. Now, with micro tapering, you actually do reductions, but more frequently. So let's say, for instance, you wanted to remove 0.1 mLs from a 1 milliliter syringe, so essentially a 10% reduction. One way of doing that is to remove it all in one go every 30 days. But another way of doing that is actually to remove one of these spaces every 3 days. Instead of subjecting your brain and your body to the full dose reduction every 30 days, you almost balance it out throughout that 30 days. And it's the equivalent between, jumping down a flight of stairs as opposed to going down one step at a time. If you do these kind of micro reductions, it can also be more gentle on the brain. And so what I recommend for people who are having a lot of difficulty tapering and they're really sensitive is they swap over onto these micro reduction strategies where by using a precision syringe, you essentially start to drop the dose in minuscule increments every 3 days or so. And if you use these tips, what you're going to find is that you actually will be able to come off Xanax very steadily. You'll be able to come off the medication without having very uncomfortable withdrawal symptoms, and you'll be able to stop it successfully in one go. And so there you have it. That is the technique that I use to get hundreds of my patients off Xanax in my private practice. If you follow those steps, you'll be able to come off the medication and really minimize your withdrawal symptoms. To recap, I think it's totally okay to taper with tablets down to 1 milligram. At the 1 milligram mark, I would recommend getting a liquid and starting to use the syringe for more precision. And then just get creative with the size of the reductions and how frequently you do the reductions, and find a customized rate where your brain is able to accommodate those reductions without experiencing withdrawal symptoms that is disruptive to your life. Below this video, you're going to find a link to the GoodRx page where you can see the cost of getting some liquid Xanax if you are in the US and you want to use this with your doctor. I'm also going to include a link to a directory of benzodiazepine tapering wise doctors. This is a worldwide list and is supplied by the Benzo Information Coalition. It's a great place to look for a taper-friendly doctor. And finally, if you're a complicated case and you want specialized support from a clinic that solely focuses on drug withdrawal, you can check out our website, thetaperclinic.com. We have coverage areas all across the US. And so if you want me to help you specifically with your taper, you can check that out. If you're looking for more tips on how to safely taper off medications, be sure to check out our tapering tips playlist. I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you.